Hello, everyone. This is a part one of a chapter 11 lecture, decisions about vertical integration and distribution. We often say a firm is a small, medium-sized, or large. How do we define the size of a firm? For example, Anheuser-Busch produces about 125 million barrels of beer a year. Avida Brewing Company brews about 150,000 barrels of beer a year. So obviously, Anheuser-Busch is much larger than Avida Brewing Company. So when we compare the size of a firm based upon total amount of a product produced a year or over a certain time period, we are referring to the horizontal boundaries of a firm. Another way to define a firm's size is looking at how many activities a firm itself performs in-house to produce a good. So let me say it again. We're going to look at how many stages of production a firm is performing itself in-house. For example, Samsung Electronics manufactures a lot of parts for its cell phones in-house, such as OLED display panels and memory chips. On the other hand, Apple hardly produces any parts for its iPhones. Apple buys most of its parts from many independent suppliers and has them assembled somewhere in China. So in this regard, Samsung Electronics has much longer vertical boundaries than Apple does. So when we compare the size of a firm based upon the various stages of a production a firm performs in-house, we are referring to the vertical boundaries of a firm. So chapter 11 is simply a story about the length of the vertical boundaries of a firm. And from the acquisition of raw materials to the distribution of finished products. So how much of this vertical boundaries, okay, is it done in-house or is it done by outside independent suppliers? And we call this the supply chain. And the supply chain consists of many distinct production and distribution functions. So let me turn to the lecture note. So here you see a figure that represents a simple, highly stylized supply chain of a firm. So as I said earlier, the supply chain is consisting of many distinct production and distribution functions. And so it is all about the length of a firm's vertical boundaries. So production starts at the top of the supply chain with the acquisition of raw materials. And as the raw materials are transformed into intermediate goods, we move downstream until the final products are distributed or sold to final consumers. And obviously, some firms have a much longer supply chain or vertical boundaries, and some firms have a relatively short supply chain. So then, what is vertical integration? When a firm is producing output at more than one stage of supply chain, the firm is said to be vertically integrated. So most of the firms are to some degree vertically integrated because it is almost impossible to find a firm that performs only one stage of a production process in-house. So some firms are more vertically integrated than others. Then what are the two main decisions facing managers about vertical integration? So basically you can ask a question like this. So if you are the manager of a firm, or if you are the decision maker of a firm, so how would you decide on the length of your supply chain? For example, how many upstream divisions would you like to have in-house? And how many downstream divisions would you like to have in-house? The more the outside the independent firms you use, the shorter is your supply chain. Or the more stages of a production you perform in-house, the longer is your supply chain. So, in essence, the managers have to make a decision about the length of their supply chain. And there are two main decisions. One is regarding input, and the other one is regarding output. First, regarding input. Should you buy an input or a part from a market firm or an independent supplier, or should you produce that input or part internally, or should you acquire a productive capacity to produce an input or part? So that's one decision. So this decision is pertinent to upstream of what? Your supply chain. Now, next decision making is regarding output. Should you sell your product directly to consumers, or should you let outside independent retailers, distributors sell your product? So this decision making is pertinent to downstream of what? Your supply chain. So in essence, these two decisions, one is regarding input, the other is regarding output. These decisions are in essence make or buy decisions. So make or buy decisions. So here, what do you mean by make is what? Through vertical integration, you produce them internally. And the buy means you use market firms. or you may say independent suppliers. So if you decided to make something, then what? You expand your supply chain. But if you decide to buy something instead of producing them internally, then what? Your supply chain will become shorter. So in essence, it's all about make or buy decisions. So before we discuss the uh, the vertical integration in depth, so we're gonna first briefly examine the option to replace vertical integration. So I said a moment ago, it's all about make or buy decision. So make means what? You produce something or you do perform certain stages of production in-house, internally. Buy means instead of what? Performing certain stages internally, you let outside independent firms do it. So obviously, make or vertical integration is the option to replace using market firms or buying. On the other hand, buying is what? Or using market firms is the option to replace vertical integration. Okay. So first, let's take a look at benefits of using market. Now, when do we say market is using market? When a firm is using parts or intermediate goods produced by other independent sellers, market firms, or when a firm is using retailers, distributors, to sell its product, then we say the firm is using market. So using a market is often the less expensive option, especially when products or services are highly standardized. Because those parts or intermediate goods are highly standardized, you can buy them whenever you need at the many different places. So you really don't need to have any legal relationship or legally binding contract with another supplier. So we call this using a spot market. So whenever you use a spot market, it means you just go out and buy something that you need at any time. But using a market is also an option when a product or input that you need is highly specialized or customized, or when you need them on a regular basis repeatedly. This is also using a market because you are not producing something internally. You still buy something from independent seller or independent market firm. But when you can buy something that you need from independent market firms without any legal relationship or without any legally binding contract, we call that using a spot market. So using a spot market is what? Within the category of using a market. Okay. So just to remember this, using a market is the option to replace vertical integration. And using a market is often less expensive option when it is standardized And then in that particular case, when you can buy something from independent sellers or suppliers without any contract, legal contract, we call that using a spot market. But using a market also could be used when you need something that is highly specialized or be customized, or when you need something repeatedly on a regular basis. You can still have them supplied by independent market firms. Okay, so using a market has what? I mean, you have two options. So one with a legal relationship contract, also one without any legal contract. Okay, now let's talk about vertical integration. Now, vertical integration simply means what? As I said earlier, it's make. Instead of buying something from independent suppliers, you make them internally. So within your own company, you create some upstream divisions and some downstream divisions, and they will have the what? Transactions between those what? Upstream and downstream divisions. But they are still within the same company. So that's why we call vertical integration sometimes intra-firm transactions, within firm transactions. But on the other hand, using market means what? You have a transaction between you and an independent outside firm. So between firms, between two different firms. So that's why using market is often referred to as interfirm transactions. Okay. So most of the firms are to some degree vertically integrated. Some will produce enough of an intermediate good and to transfer some of it internally and to sell the surplus, the remaining, to other firms. For example, Hyundai Motors Company produces a lot of car engines, more than its downstream division requires. So Hyundai Motor Company is selling some of its car engines to another company like a Chrysler. Energizer is also a good example. Energizer is producing not only batteries but also flashlights. So it produces the batteries more than enough, more than its downstream division, like a flashlight division requires. And the surplus of the batteries will be sold directly to consumers. So it's a vertically integrated. But it is also common that upstream division of a company produces less inputs than its downstream division requires. When it happens, the firm is said to be partially vertically integrated, because the downstream division requires a lot more of inputs than that the upstream division produces. So how can the downstream division fill the gap? So downstream division is actually what? It's gonna fill the gap, the shortage, by purchasing inputs or parts from outside independent suppliers. So when downstream division gets inputs it needs from both its own upstream division and also from independent market firms, we say the firm is partially vertically integrated. Okay. All right. So our next topic is types of vertical integration. So there are two types of vertical integration, forward and backward integrations. Now recall this, vertical integration is all about the length of a firm's vertical boundaries or the length of the supply chain. So you can expand your own vertical chain integration or supply chain in either way. You can expand it toward upstream or you can expand it toward downstream. First, forward integration. When a firm is acquiring downstream productive capacity, a division closer to consumers, then we say the firm is being the is a what we say that is a what forward integration. So once again, forward integration means, let me go back to the figure here. So forward integration means you are acquiring capacity closer to downstream, closer to the consumers. So we say it is a what? Forward integration. On the other hand, if you expand your supply chain toward upstream, toward the acquisition of raw materials, or if you add here another division that produces another intermediate good, then what? We call that backward integration. Okay, so let me go back to where we were. So forward integration is you are expanding your supply chain towards closer to consumers or downstream. And the backward integration means you are acquiring upstream productive capacity. You add another input producing division. So a division farther from consumers. You're moving away from consumers. So that is a backward integration. So what kind of examples of a forward integration can you think of? For example, if a Pepsi acquires a bottling company, so that means Pepsi is the what? So let's say Pepsi used to use the what? Bottling, an independent bottling company. But if a Pepsi decides to acquire that particular productive capacity and performs the bottling functioning in-house, then what? It'll be an example of a forward integration. Why? Because typically the bottling takes a place what? Closer to consumers. Because indeed it is a what? Weight gaining production process. The raw materials of a Pepsi are not really heavy. But as you move downstream and get closer and closer to final consumers, then what? Now you add water, so it gets heavier and heavier. So that's why they typically have what? Bottling companies near major markets, because otherwise transportation would cost the company a lot of money. And another example is, what if a computer manufacturer like Dell, what if Dell takes over a retail outlet or chain stores to sell its products directly to consumers? Well, currently Dell is what? Selling its products what? Through many different outlets using many independent retailers. But if Dell somehow decides to sell its products directly to consumers by taking over chain stores, then it'll be what? An example of a forward integration. Now, Can you think of some backward integration examples? For example, if Dell acquires a chip manufacturer, computer chip manufacturer like Intel, then what? Dell's supply chain is what? Expanding towards upstream, towards the acquisition of raw materials, or it is expanding and moving farther from the end users, consumers. So that'll be an example of what? Backward integration. Okay. All right. So remember that there are two types of integration. One is forward integration. That means your supply chain is expanding towards upstream, no, downstream or the final consumers. And the backward integration is your supply chain is expanding towards upstream or closer to the acquisition of raw materials. Now, the next two terms are the opposite of a vertical integration. So first, outsourcing. Outsourcing happens when a firm is contracting with an independent supplier to produce an input for the firm. So, for example, Apple is contracting with a Taiwanese memory chip maker, and that company is now what, obligated to supply certain amount of computer chips to Apple uh, on a regular basis. So Apple is what, buying an input it needs from another independent company instead of producing it internally. And that's simply what we call outsourcing. And indeed, outsourcing is the opposite of backward integration. Okay. So if you produce an input, an intermediate good internally, then what? It is what? Backward integration. But instead, you buy an input or part from an independent supplier, then it is what called outsourcing. Okay. So that's why outsourcing is the opposite of a backward integration. Then what is a divestiture? When a firm is selling or spinning off a division of its business as a new company, we call that divestiture. So, for example, a company has many upstream and downstream divisions. And if the manager of the company decides to sell one of its divisions or spin off one of its divisions, so the division spun off will become a new company. And we call such a process divestiture. Now, so divestiture is what? Instead of expanding your supply chain, actually you sell or spin off one of the divisions and so make your supply chain a little shorter. So that is a divestiture, and that's why divestiture is the opposite of integration. So you are selling or spinning off some of your existing productive capacity. So your supply chain is shrinking. That is divestiture. So the outsourcing is the opposite of a backward integration, and the divestiture is the opposite of integration. Well, a divestiture most commonly results from managerial decision to stop, operating the one of its business units because it is deemed uh, the redundant or it is a non-essential part of the what its core competency. So for whatever reason, when managers believe some some of the existing capacity, some of its divisions are either redundant or not necessarily part of the company's core competency, then what they may decide to sell them off. That is exactly what we call divestiture. One of the most famous court-ordered divestiture is the breakup of the Bell system in 1982. The U.S. government determined that Bell controlled too large a portion of the nation's telephone service. It was virtually a gigantic monopolist. Virtually all home phones, all the pay phones on the street, they were all managed by one company, Bell system. So that's why U.S. government decided to break it up, and so they brought antitrust charge against the Bell company in 1974, and so finally the breakup happened in 1982. And I don't know whether you remember names of these companies like Bell South, Bell Pacific. So that's what. So when the Bell system was broken up, and they created a lot of what we call baby bells, local telephone service companies like Bell South or Bell Pacific, and the AT&T was given the right uh, to provide the long distance call service. Right? So that's an example of what a divestiture. And so this will be the end of the part one of a chapter 11 lecture. And we're going to discuss the remaining topics in part two. Thank you.